Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long with the Financial Repression Authority. I have with me today Anthony Wile of the Wile Group joining us from Toronto. Many of our listeners may be most familiar with Anthony's work as the founder and at one time editor of the well-recognized website, The Daily Bell. Welcome, Anthony.
Thanks, Gord. Pleasure to be here.
It is. It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to talking to you. I know you're no longer associated with the Daily Bell, but I have to tell you, it's done some of the finest work for years in philosophical thinking, out on the edge, and I know you were a big part of that. So I gotta thank you for the work. You were often talking about things that others weren't talking about at the time. So.
Well, it's always nice to hear that, and we've worked very hard to try to ensure that we're giving at least our opinion from our bias as cleanly and as efficiently as we could, and we're happy always to hear that people enjoyed the work that we delivered.
Could you give our listeners a bit of an overview of your background and the things you're involved with now, because they may not be familiar with it?
Sure. Well, I was born in Canada. I was educated in business school in Canada as well. Subsequently, I went into venture capitalism after a short career with Canadian financial institutions, where I went through the Bay Street, so to speak, program, if you will. Following which I had much greater desire to be involved in venture capitalism. My family, in fact, has been involved in venture capitalism for 4 decades, approaching 5. Heavily focused on the mining industry, being Canadian. That's typically a foregone conclusion in venture capitalism. But generally speaking, I've lived all around the world in different centers, Switzerland, what have you, building and developing an international network of financial relationships that obviously bring a power base, enabling larger and better quality investment opportunities to mature. Along the way, I also took a deep interest in understanding the economy, the world, the way it really works. I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with peers in the industry who were very important in helping me to understand things. People like Harry Brown, for example, who was like a father figure to me. Many people, though. I mean, there's a long list, so if I start naming them, it'll get a little lengthy in this interview. But in essence, it sparked a desire to share the knowledge that I was gleaning with others, and thus the Daily Bell is an example of a forum through which the ideas, the philosophy, the general approach to how we can live freer in an unfree world, to borrow a cliche, so to speak, from Harry, how the world really works and how to understand it so we can make better decisions and embrace personal responsibility for ourselves. I have a passion for that. It's always been something that, for me, it's not a business. My publishing has never been related to actual business activities. It's always been about sharing information. So venture capitalism is the way that I make a living and choose to spend my time and invest my money. I also invest my time as more of a hobby on the publishing side of life.
Not too dissimilar background to myself, I'm surprised, because that's what brought me to the greater Boston area, was venture capital and now the private equity end of it. So and I need to, before we get into some of your things you're involved with right now, and I got a couple of them pretty exciting, which I kind of gathered here before we started the show. Financial Repression Authority, our organization. I wonder if you could share what that terminology means. What does financial repression as a macro-prudential policy resonate with you, and do you have any views on it?
Financial repression. Well, I think the entire world is repressed and controlled in a way that more or less serves to benefit a very few. I've certainly been quite vociferous about that in my writings. Where I will draw the line in the interview is going into the who done it camp of discussion. But repression financially, there are many areas where we can see how we're repressed. We're repressed in our ability to freely move our capital where we'd like to move it in the world. We are repressed in terms of the types of investments we have access to. A perfect example for me, which is a real bone of contention. I don't believe that anybody who gets up in the morning and goes to work, no matter what they do and what their vocation might be, and earns a paycheck, brings it home, gives the part that they need to give by law to the boys in Washington, and what's remaining, that they are then in a position that they can't make a decision, rightly or wrongly, however they choose, to invest that capital. as an example. So for the past several decades, we've had very repressive rules and regulations when it comes to the little guy, as it's referred to, or the unqualified investor being able to invest their capital in, say, a private opportunity. You're in private equity, you know better as much as anyone else what I'm referring to. So there's been an elite, so to speak, regulated structure that forces only those who are part of the $1 million plus or accredited investor camp to have access to those investments, other than a few very minor exceptions. Now, there have been changes recently.
I was just going to say, but there's some changes happening in Canada for, we call it accredited investors, but exempting terminology used in Canada, where smaller investors are now being allowed to enter into the private equity. I believe it's $10,000 if I recall properly, but it's Canada's beginning to do some changes there.
Yeah, that is true, and thankfully so, but it's your terminology, now being allowed. I have a big problem with us being allowed.
Precisely.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming from, the repression point of view.
Agree with you fully.
So, I think, of course, like I said, I believe that people should be able to invest their capital, whether they want to buy 5,000 packages of Bazooka bubblegum or they want to go invest in this, or whatever it might be. It's their money. It's their decision. They should have the ability to make a decision. And I've met many people who have lots of capital, and I would suggest aren't necessarily as intelligent as people would suggest they would be with such an amount of capital. And I've met lots of people with no capital who can certainly make a valid decision for themselves. Bottom line is, we shouldn't be trying to we should not be trying to organize society in a way that monetarily determines who and who not are capable of making a decision for themselves. I think most people would agree that's just ludicrous on its face.
But it's actually not just ludicrous. There are many things that are happening that are making it more and more restrictive, contrary to what I just mentioned in Canada, where they were leading the edge. But where I'm referring to is there's things such as FATCA around the world, which is really a form of capital controls, PFIC, which is a way of restricting it through taxation, and I can go on. Yes. But I would suggest that I was to talk to 99 out of 100 investors, they wouldn't have a clue what I'm referring to there until they wander into the international marketplace.
Exactly. So you're sure they sure don't need an education on that in Switzerland, I can assure you, or London, or other cities around the world, or countries or cities around the world where there's a financial desire, typically at least, to access venture markets. This is a big problem for the United States. For example, we personally as a group try to stay away from private equity investments in the United States simply because of the fact that we have a very large international network who just aren't interested in being involved in U.S.-based opportunities at this time for the very concerns that you've just enunciated, FATCA and these other reasons. Canada, this is an actual win for this country, so to speak, from a venture capital perspective, because Canada still has a great deal of respect internationally within the markets we're referring to. So it's a detriment to the U.S. that they're pushing so hard on the information gathering and we'll say levying front from a taxation perspective, as they are, because they're actually killing the nucleus of capital abroad that otherwise would find its way to their shores. So it's a problem.
Yeah, our regulations are so onerous and so restrictive that they're leading to the point where a lot of people are leaving industries, not talking about investors, but getting out of industries because there's just too many regulations. The most recent I just saw was people that are CTAs, commodity trading advisories. 30 to 40% have shut down the shop, and it's not because there isn't money. It's just the regulatories are just so restrictive and so onerous to them that it's tough. And that's an example. So there's a lot of repression going on in all sorts of forms. Whether it's intended or not, or whether it's to gain competitive advantage, whether to use regulatory arbitrage, a lot of this is just good competitive strategy that the government's the dupe in the middle in some cases. But I don't want to take us off track on that one. You just mentioned before we started that you had been down here and you'd been in New York, and you were talking about the war on drugs. Is there anything you can share with us there that you've learned? You're starting to glean observations?
Yeah, there's a lot. I was in New York. I got back last night. For those who aren't aware, there was the UNGAS 2016, which is the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, which happens very rarely. The last one was in 1998. This one was supposed to be in 2019, but it was hurried up to this past week as a result of several factors. I mean, one of them being that sovereign nations were jumping ahead of international policy, if you will, and making their own rules and regulations with respect to the war on drugs, or the approach that they take to the war on drugs. Canada is an example of a country that has moved in its own direction to establish a national medicinal marketplace for the distribution of medicinal cannabis products, as an example. Our recently elected Prime Minister Trudeau has made it very clear that by June, or roughly the spring of 2017, whatever the spring is in his mind, there will be legislation in the country for an adult use recreational marketplace as well. There are a lot of countries that are moving in this direction. Colombia is another country that I spend a great deal of time in and have for 15 years doing business. And they're making a lot of important moves as well. Mexico, I mean, we can go on and on. The world is changing in this respect, and rightfully so. You know, first of all, I, being very libertarian in my views, I again don't believe any of this nonsensical approach to the war on drugs makes, well, it's illogical. The way it's been dealt with, focusing on supply side only. They talk about educating, and they talk about working with educating the demand side, and trying to reduce drug use. All of us can agree is a noble thing to discuss, noble intentions. How do you do that? How do you get rid of this demand? And one of the big things that I've been writing about a lot lately, and penning a piece for a national publication that'll be released shortly here, is how do you get rid of this? And there's many ideas, but one of the ideas is, first and foremost, if you're going to educate somebody, you need to know who you're talking to. Who is this person? And if you're going to talk to somebody, you must have a means of communication. Today, the demand side of this industry is unknown, other than as a group, an umbrella. But you don't talk to an umbrella. You don't talk to a group. You don't talk to a government. You talk to someone within the government. That's how life works. And if you're going to have a communication strategy that's going to try to mitigate the use of drugs and alleviate so to speak, the demand, or relieve the size of the demand in the marketplace by education and encouraging people to think twice about what they're ingesting and putting in their bodies, you need to have a means of communication. By legalizing and through a controlled, and of course we all know it will be heavily regulated. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of regulation in the world, but we deal with reality here. So the regulatory side of the industry will ensure, just like in the medicinal cannabis space as we see it today, that the drugs themselves will be maturely distributed, or should be maturely distributed. And as a result of that, you will gather information and data. Think about it this way. I don't know about you, but wherever I go on the internet, I can't get rid of Peter Schiff these days. I have little banners following me wherever I go, asking me if I want to read this report or whatever it might be. So Peter's doing a good job of making sure the people that care about, for example, precious metals know he exists. There's technology here today to communicate with these people if we know who they are. So if you want to really make a change and cease the funding to many of these illegal organizations around the world who are causing so much disruptiveness, whether it's in Colombia, for example, whether it's in Afghanistan or wherever it might be, one of the things that can make a huge difference in this and impact in this is cutting off their funding source, which in many cases is directly related to the war on drugs, which props up prices, giving the illegal marketplace a massive windfall by entering into the fray of supplying this faceless demand. Get to know the demand, control the regulatory interface, and through that process, make sure that the demand is also getting healthier products that they can ingest. They're doing it anyway. Why do you want these people to be taking products that are filled with who knows what from God knows who, and at the end of the day, just driving up healthcare budgets as well? I mean, at the end of the day, this is all ridiculous and all connected. But if we open up the highway system and have a rational understanding that the demand already exists, we're not talking about normalizing drugs. We're talking about creating a highway system that develops a communication, the communication ability for those who wish to impart their views on how you should approach life and reduce your consumption of these products and all these things, gives you the ability to do this. The technology is there to do this. You remove the black market from the distribution side of the business, which cuts off funding to terrorism and these other sorts of things. And I don't want to use the word terrorism too generally here, but you get the overall drift, I think, of what I'm saying. There is now an understanding by certain countries in the world, especially those most disadvantaged from the war on drugs in terms of violence, countries like Mexico, countries like Colombia, Ecuador, and others, who have been very vociferous about this point of view. And finally, it appears now, the rest of the world is listening. The rest of the world is realizing that it's not the suppliers necessarily who are the problem. Of course, they're part of it. But it can be alleviated through a mature discussion that recognizes human nature being what it is. They're individuals deciding to do these things, to take these drugs. We don't endorse it. Nobody suggests that that's a good thing. But what we're simply saying is get to know who those people are, profile, understand, develop strategies of communication to really speak to people, not just the faceless mass. So there are a lot of changes in that regard that are finally being listened to at the higher levels.
Anthony, are you seeing in this whole discussion investment opportunities that are jumping out? Different approaches. I'm not talking about specific company, but groups or areas that are going to be growth areas?
Without a doubt. And here I've written, anyone that wants to get further information can just search my name, Anthony Wile. You'll see an article I wrote at the Globe and Mail about 3 or 4 months ago here, which is our national newspaper, as you know, in Canada, outlining, it was more of a cautionary note, if you will, to people saying, you should really step back here. Take your time and do not rush in, because fools rush in, and money is quickly departed from when you rush in too quickly. And I believe in this industry, there has been a lot of misfunding that has occurred where regional opportunities have received significant amounts of capital while the regulatory environment has not yet shaped itself. And the regulatory environment is what will ultimately determine where the profit margins lie within the vertical of getting the product from the fields where it's grown through the processing that turns it into medicinal or standardized products, which is how everything in the world trades, whether it's a bag of peanuts or a bottle of water. It's not going to be any different with cannabis or any other products. But in the cannabis industry, there is a change coming here that will affect many aspects of this business. For example, distribution. Let's take Canada. You have all these licensed distributors or producers who are distributors as well. Mail service delivery. Now that's something that hasn't had the support of the Postal Union. The RCMP, which is our federal police force, of course, has been quite vociferous as well about the fact that this is a very highly unsecure means of distribution. Many of these post offices in these small towns and villages and what have you are just not equipped to be handling this high value product. Postal workers don't want to walk down the street with it. But it makes no sense. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're calling it a medicine, do you pick up the phone and call somebody through a telephone who's not a doctor, not a nurse, and have them prescribe some funny-sounding strain that you roll up and burn, which is another issue that will be put to bed fairly shortly. And that'll never get support, burning product from the WHO, the UN, or any of the medical associations. It's just simply never going to, it's just not going to happen. Medicines aren't delivered that way. And the combustion side of this is something we don't need to discuss as to the hazards that is for our health. But there will be a different generation of products that hit the marketplace over the next few years. And as they hit the marketplace, you can pretty much bank they'll be delivered through the same channels that we have traditionally received medicines through, i.e. pharmacies. Places where people have an interface to know what are the drugs you're taking. For example, if I'm a person who has heart problems and I'm on blood thinners and maybe I'm diabetic and, there's other issues that surface when you take one drug and mix it with other drugs. And none of this research has been clinically developed to any great level at this point in time. The large pharma companies today, you want to call this a pain management product, for example. Does anybody really think, living in the world that we live in, that big pharma are going to allow a cottage industry to step in and take away one of the most lucrative parts of their business model? Come on, no way. These drugs will go through the FDA, the EMEA, and the other channels they must go through before they hit the shelves in any sort of a mainstream situation where you walk into CVS and you buy a pain relief formula or it's prescribed to you through a doctor in a meaningful way. I'm not saying it's the way it should be. It's just the reality. We live in a regulatory democracy. The FDA and the EMEA are the frontline interfaces between big pharma and the drugs they want to put on the shelf, and they're also the frontline interface that keeps you from getting your drugs through them and on the shelf. It's just the way it is. So, this is a big boys game that will be handled by big boys when it comes to the production of what the products are and how they're distributed. And the distribution channels, what I wrote in the Globe and Mail, was simply this. And subsequently, we've seen the largest pharmacy chain in the country come out with the endorsement of the Canadian Pharmacy Association as well, that they are now behind this shift towards a pharmacy distribution model. This is something that overnight literally puts an X over about 50% of the revenues that would have belonged to, or today do, to the licensed producers in Canada who distribute through the mail. Today they have the whole vertical. Tomorrow they won't. As a result of that, those investments are dramatically affected, and thus the viability of anybody who invested in those investments, in my opinion, in our opinion, I should say. And as a result, what I simply have to say to investors is be very careful before you run into any regional market play. There are other considerations that people who understand the way this world works will understand when I say this very, very clearly. Again, I am not an ardent environmentalist. I believe we all should be great stewards to our planet. I certainly am not, waving pom-poms at Al Gore speeches on the weekend. But the reality is the world buys into the whole concept that we must lower our carbon footprint anywhere we can. Now, traditional industries, to say, coal-fired power plants or what have you, it's very difficult to come in and just remake those into greener operations. You can do things around the margins, but there are too many jobs affected by it and all these other considerations. It's a political issue. Here we're dealing with an industry that is not a political issue, at least today, because you have a global black market that is not what you would call an industry. It's not an industry. It's not a global, traded. It's not an industry that is regulated or synthesized and globally traded within at this point. Now, as that develops, there are certain regions of the world where you can produce in an environmentally friendly, net positive environmental impact kind of fashion, or sustainable development, if you will. Countries around the equator, ideally, because when you're growing cannabis, for example, you need 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of darkness to create the flowering cycle. That's how the plants naturally flower. If you're doing it indoors, you're creating that environment artificially. Lots of electricity. You're using your water sources typically from local grid water. All of these the two big impacts that the two big inputs that you're utilizing in order to make the product strain the overall environment, if you will. And you end up with a more or less synthetically grown indoor product. You can grow this product outdoors for pennies a gram, and you can grow it in very controlled environments that provide a net positive environmental impact versus a net negative environmental impact, and you can create it for a price point that is a fraction of what it's grown for in the more northern climates or more southern climates. Basically, when you step a few degrees north or south of the equator, you incur more additional costs, and you also generate a larger, you take away from what would be a positive environmental impact, taking out CO2, putting back oxygen and these other things, and you move into a direction of eventually a net negative environmental impact. All of this can be alleviated if the focus of the cultivation is in areas that can actually generate, as I said again, a positive environmental impact. And you will see, I believe, having spent enough time within the international discussions over the past couple of years, not just this last week in New York, I think you're going to see that the UN, the WHO, the WTO, and other organizations are going to be quite focused on the environmental side of this new industry, in which the standards and the protocols related to cultivation and other related issues can be determined up front by private sector, and then of course rolled out across around the world with endorsement and the support of agencies that see that this is the better way to do this. Let nations that are like Canada focus more on the post-production type of business, developing medications, newer delivery systems, making whatever out of the oil that is developed. But that's where we're headed. It's a standardized medicinal grade oil marketplace where certain areas of the world where they have the climatic conditions to be able to grow these products at lower margins, lower cost structures with environmentally friendly sources of electricity and water and all these things, where it creates a vertical price where you take the exporting from, say, an equatorial nation, like a Colombia, for example. You have a government that, of course, wants its cut. You have the domestic distributor, say in Canada, that wants to obviously make its profitability for distributing the products. And then you have your government partner in this country that wants to take its cut as well. There's a vertical thing that goes together here to create a price structure. Today, if you look at Canada, the entire black market is serviced primarily by Canadian black market operators. They have the client base. They own the clients. You want to wrestle the client base away, you better not ask them to pay 2 to 3 times the amount of money to get the same product they're already getting today. This is a problem in extinguishing the black market. And in Canada's case, if you take a bunker operator somewhere where they're hidden away, growing their plants and doing their thing, you then go to a legal bunker operation because the climate forces this sort of a structure. They have basically the same cost structure of producing the plants, excepting that the legal operator has a new partner in the room that the black market doesn't, the government. So tack on that big chunk of expense, and I'll call it an expense. And then you have the regulatory compliance layer that is imposed, of course, on the white market. Quality assurance, security, these things cost a lot of money. That also increases the cost that the white market has that the black market doesn't. They're not necessarily big time concerned about the quality of what you're ingesting, at least when it comes to the production methodologies. Where you run into a problem is when you have a country like Canada, for example, where the black market that has the population that currently uses the products, and you want them to shift to a white market that wants basically to clean up the street, but they're asking you to pay a lot more for it. Tough move. In reality, you're not going to be as successful as you will if you otherwise would allow the importation of the products that can be produced at a fraction of the price. I'll give you an example. In Colombia, you can produce a gram of cannabis flower for about 5 cents a gram. In Canada, you're not doing it for less than $2 a gram, more than likely closer to 3. That's a huge difference. You need 5 or 6 grams to make a gram of oil. That oil, so call it 30 cents a gram, more or less in Colombia, versus 15 to 18 cost structure here or in Colorado. That's why in Colorado, a gram of oil trades for between $30 and $35 a gram wholesale, because the cost to produce it is approximately $20 a gram. So if the world recognizes that there's a way to get better, environmentally friendly produced, all natural products at a cost point that makes room for the exporting nation's government, the importing nation's government, and the producer and the distributors, where the total vertical of integration is less than what the black market can produce it for in the country like Canada, for example, now you can talk about moving the black market out for a number of reasons, cost included. So there's a lot of discussion happening at this point in time within the international circles as to how best to embrace, monitor, secure, and develop international trade in this industry. And I would suggest that investors who are looking to be part of this global shift, and it's a big one, would be paying attention to nations, at least on the production side, where you're able to enter in with a footprint that is positively affecting the environment and providing the ability to produce products that are medicinal grade, standardized at price points that just, quite frankly, nobody else can. And to put an example on the table, I'll use Colombia again. They produce 80% of the cut flowers that are purchased in the United States today, 20% of the global supply. Now, why doesn't California supply it? Why doesn't Florida supply their own backyard? Because they can't. They just don't. The flowering cycle is the same for chrysanthemums as it is for cannabis. Anybody that wants to tell you that cannabis is a whole lot more sophisticated and difficult to grow than chrysanthemums is a blowing smoke. So, I think there are opportunities out there, but people need to look down the road 2 or 3 years, not get caught in traps like many of these Canadian producers, in my opinion, are now finding themselves caught in, where bigger boys are coming in and pharmacy chains are expressing their interest to deliver the products that it takes out, just like I said, overnight 50%. There's no sense investing in a marketplace where government regulation overnight can completely flip upside down the viability of your investment. And that's the environment we're in right now.
Anthony, just staying on Colombia, and you spent so much time there, down there, and their economy, where are they on this politically, in supporting it, endorsing it, leading the charge, and what does it potentially mean to their economy?
It means a lot to their economy, and it means a lot in other areas that we can talk about as well. Look, in the war on drugs, Colombia has suffered more than any nation in this world. Okay, it's just a fact of life. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have been murdered during this war on drugs. You have the over 5 million people displaced. Another 5 million people have left the country during this 40-year rampage that has been disastrous for the nation. The country desires itself to rehabilitate its reputation. Now, I am fortunate to have had meetings with people in the government at very high levels, including the president himself and past presidents and what have you. I understand the nature of their concerns and where they see Colombia taking its position moving forward. Their focus here is simply this. Colombia has the right ingredients to be able to do what we were discussing earlier, produce all-natural, environmentally friendly products that are processed into medicinal-grade standardized oil extracts, which is the future of this business. And we can get into that if you like in a little bit. But the reality is it's an opportunity to reputationally rehabilitate the way the world looks at Colombia. And already I can certainly tell you, I haven't been there for 15 years, and practically every month I'm there for at least a week to 10 days. The country is far from backwards when it comes to their scientific research capabilities. Their universities are top-notch. I'm not going to name what we're involved with in Colombia, but certainly the relationships that we have are integrated into the existing fabric of research and development in that nation. There is more than enough capability. Certainly the experience in the flower business is completely transferable to growing cannabis versus growing chrysanthemums, if you will. The infrastructure is all there. They're leaders in the space. They're agronomists, and the people who are the backbone of that industry don't need any manuals on substituting this plant for another. The processing capabilities are there. The government recently passed a decree. Santos issued the decree on December 22nd, actually, of last year, December 2015. Excuse me. The decree was built upon a law called Law 30 of 1986, which already provided for the legalized production and distribution of medicinal and scientific cannabis-related products. So the law was already on the books. It was a matter of now creating a framework around the law that would structure how such an industry would be developed. And that's what the decree paved way for in December 22nd. The decree is innovative in many ways. It embraces a series of licenses you must apply for and receive before you can, legally be involved in this industry. And we're certainly not talking about illegal drug production here. And those licenses are first and foremost a manufacturing license, because Colombia has prohibited the exportation of dry flower product. They understand that the future of this industry is standardized medicinal-grade oil extracts, not burnable, smokable flower product. So before you can obtain a cultivation license, you must obtain a manufacturing license or processing license, if you will. But you apply for them all at the same time. So, for example, one of the primary things that we're involved with in the world today has applied. It's the only company to date that has. I think they applied in January, but nonetheless, they applied for all the licenses with an incredible team of people who bring all the experience necessary to do this business properly for a long haul. And subsequent to receiving those licenses, which include manufacturing first, then cultivation, and then an exportation license. So the government has paved the way for a legal business to develop in Colombia, working with the universities, whereby the climatic and economic conditions that already have them at the top end of the global distribution and game, if you will, of cut flowers, for example, which is a very important multi-billion-dollar industry globally, in order to be able to embrace this new industry and be leaders in the scientific and technological way in which these products should be standardized, paved the way by example of showing how they can be developed in an environmentally friendly manner, and helping to rehabilitate the country's reputation internationally with one of the two plants that has been responsible for this entire war that has caused so much grief and aggravation in the country. So the country has positioned itself at the front side, and I would argue is the best country in the world to be considering for this business, and it's pretty tough for anybody to counter those arguments, to be quite frank.
Anthony, you said you've been, going to Colombia for 15 years, thereabouts, I recall. What originally initiated that, in your involvement and your steady relationship in the country? What types of industries and business opportunities are you seeing?
Sure. Well, what initiated it was the election of a man named Alvaro Uribe, who's a friend and somebody who any Colombian you speak to will tell you is responsible for bringing in the strong hand and heavy heart that was necessary to clean up a terrible situation. As anybody knows, coming out of the late 90s and into the early 2000s, Colombia was a backwater of instability. I mean, it was terrible. And Alvaro instituted policies that opened up avenues with protection in place for foreign investment. He did many things to transform the country to becoming a positive place to do business. And my family had been investing in mining operations in Colombia in the 80s. We already had established relationships within the country. So yes, it was a combination of the mining cycle in 2000 and early 2000s being something we had identified as a place we wanted to be very heavily invested with the right opportunities. Colombia for us was one of the choice destinations in which to invest, and we certainly did do that. So it was mining, but it's also been we've invested in real estate. We invest in all private equity, by the way. We do not invest, and I try to stay away from as much as possible the stock markets of the world. I'm more interested in developing real wealth with real businesses that can generate positive cash flow and sustainable long-term positioning within their respective markets. So we're really focused in private equity, and we're focused in Colombia. We don't see a country in the world today that offers as much opportunity with the peace process in its final stages of being completed, along with the myriad of opportunities that exist in that country. Quite frankly, you go back and you take a look at what's happened for 40, 50 years. There are many areas of that country that have been sealed off, inaccessible, totally underexplored when it comes to resources and other such opportunities. There's great opportunity in the country for investing in real estate, tourism. It's really a nation about to move and spring forward in many ways. And on the cannabis cultivation side, I also think the hemp industry in Colombia is going to develop very rapidly, and we're presently doing due diligence on some certain project that we're very, very keen on in Colombia at this time. We've yet to really move on it, but look, I think the country's filled with opportunity, and for us, it's where we're going to be, at least at this time, keeping our eyes intently on the ball for the next several years.
What was a detriment, the drug issues, for your other business enterprises, mining, real estate opportunities, has now turned into a tremendous new opportunity, hasn't it? It's just dramatic, and for the country. But in the overall area, South America, are you seeing shifts that are changing economically? New technologies, new innovations? Well, let's start with Colombia, but in the area, is there a shift because there's been so much economic instability, or at least the reputation in the areas, and we're seeing better leadership, we're seeing better levels of stability. Are the investment climates really starting to emerge in Latin America and South America? Or am I being too generic?
You're being too generic, yeah. I mean, the problem, Colombia, the answer is yes. You can
it's very country politically sensitive.
Highlight that one. You can highlight that. But you look at the neighbors. I mean, Venezuela, just put an X over that. We don't need to, I think, explain that to anybody. They get that. Ecuador, very, very, very Bolivarian in its leanings. Paraguay, Bolivia. I mean, these countries are unfortunately mired in a mindset of socialism. They're not really, for whatever reason it appears, learning as much as they should from the Venezuelan example.
After Colombia, where is the next best environment that you isolated?
Well, for me, it's Chile. I mean, Chile is a country that offers reasonable stability, but I also would suggest that it's difficult to compare the opportunities in Colombia with Chile today. I mean, really, Chile is a copper exporter, and there's reasonable opportunities in different agricultural industries. There's things in Chile that you could consider investment worthy for sure, but not to the degree that you're looking at things in Colombia. Again, it stands out among all the crowd in Latin America as way above the rest is the bottom line at this time. I mean, Brazil's a mess. I mean, all you have to do is turn on any news broadcast of what's happening within that country to see the massive corruption and the backlash that's currently happening against the current regime there. You see Argentina, there's some moves being made, it appears, to maybe try to reverse some of the damage that's been done in that country, but it's going to take time. All in all, there really is, for us at least, only one country that we are, seriously interested in Latin America, and that is Colombia.
Any comments on Uruguay?
Well, I mean, I think Uruguay is, for anyone that I've spent a fair amount of time in Uruguay. We almost opened an office in Uruguay a few years ago. I think Uruguay is a financial center, and it's farming as well. There are farmland opportunities certainly in Uruguay that can be developed. Again, I'll come back to this. The bottom line is, look, when you're growing anything, you need a certain amount of sunlight, you need a certain amount of water, and you need hopefully, preferably, very low cost but highly fertile soil in which to produce whatever it is you're going to produce. Colombia offers that as well. Again, coming back to this, in the Llanos region, which is an area where typically coca production has dominated. It was still is a fairly heavily FARC-infested region, but it's been opening up quite rapidly. So now you have this amazing area that is like literally millions of hectares that is perfect and ripe with a climate that Uruguay doesn't have. It's the same thing in the cannabis industry. It's not on the equator. I mean, you're a lot of degrees removed to the south in Uruguay. You don't have that consistent climate year-round with 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of rainfall that just stays steady Eddie day after day after day. And as a result, you're never going to be able to produce something in Uruguay in the cannabis industry that can be done at the cost point and as naturally as you can do it in Colombia. It's just a reality. And that goes for many of the agricultural products. So Uruguay, look, from a financial center, they've got some very good free trade zone legislation. In Uruguay, in Montevideo, there's at least one very large and prominent free trade zone. But is that really the kind of, that's a financial business. That's a credit card company wanting to offshore its services and, handle a portion of their business in Uruguay. There's American mortgage companies that are set up in Uruguay, for example, that are handling the collections for those who are in default and basically taking the money offshore and keeping it tax-free. There's all this kind of thing happening in Uruguay. It's creative financial engineering to a large degree that occurs, I would suggest, in Uruguay. You don't see that so much in Colombia, for example, where it's more grassroots, agriculturally driven. And I think it attracts Colombia also people like, for example, Jim Rogers is a very close friend and has been a consultant to my family office for the last couple of years. He has his own life. He does his own things. But we obviously, he's actually involved in as an advisor to this project in Colombia in the cannabis industry that we're doing as well, and was just with me in Colombia. I believe it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago for a conference we were holding, or we were participating in Colombia for foreign investors. But the bottom line is, again, I come back to this. When you have a country that has suffered repression. I'll use your repression terminology. As long as Colombia has suffered this environment, you've repressed opportunity. You've repressed a plethora of things that we could sit here and discuss. That now it's like a jack in the box, and finally the pressure's taken off, and out it comes. And the people of Colombia are extremely industrious, hardworking people, especially the Antioqueños, the people in Antioquia, which is the department that houses Medellin, which is the second largest city of Colombia. They get up in the morning with the desire to be better tomorrow than they were today. They're creative. They're not just robotic. I've done lots of business in China, and I always left with a sense of, it's like a robotic society, not a lot of creativity. Colombians are very creative. And some you can clearly see that they've been creative over the years in good and bad industries. Let's put it in those terms. But they're very creative. They're industrious. They're highly educated. The middle class is booming in growth. The whole country really at this time is about to change the way I think the world is going to have a whole different view of what Colombia and Colombians are very shortly. And I believe the cannabis industry is actually, believe it or not, going to help transform that image. As ironic as that may sound.
You've given us a very convincing set of arguments, Anthony. That's the case. The perception of Colombia is an old one. and you could be blinded from some major opportunities that are emerging here very nicely in the area. We have to break. How could listeners learn more about the things you're involved with? Do you have services to help, investments to help our listeners, your writings, etc.?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier in the program, the writing and the things that I do, I don't charge for anything. I never have. So in all the years of writing books or editorials or whatever we do, I put it out there. If people want to read it, enjoy it. You can still do that. You can find at Wile Group, WILE Group.com. It's just our corporate website. There's nothing special about it, but you can always sign up, and we'll provide you with updates whenever I publish anything anywhere or have any views or speaking at a conference or whatever it might be. You can stay on top of that, and I do share my personal views and specifics about different investment ideas when it's merited. But it's not a newsletter service in the traditional sense. For us as a business, and AnthonyWile.com you can also go to and download my books for free if you'd like to read them. And the latest book, Financial Freedom, is a book that really talks about private equity from a perspective of understanding how the street works, how mainstream media works, and why we believe, by the way, in this case, that the cannabis industry will be it'll be like a lemon that the Wall Street squeezes every last little drop out of, like they do everything else, And this is an interesting thing to note. In the traditional sense, you have speculative industries competing, obviously, for speculative capital, looking for ventures and things of this nature. You traditionally had gold and silver, which today really aren't generating a great deal of speculative interest. One can clearly see. You have oil markets, which are flat. That's obviously not encouraging a lot of people to rush into oil investments these days. The alternative energy market is off because the price of oil is so low, so not a lot of people are rushing in with enthusiasm to those sorts of investments. In other words, my point is a lot of the big guerrilla sectors that typically are there competing for the speculative venture capital are silent. And as a result, you have this open doorway through which Wall Street is able to march with its latest promotion, which it will do here. There's a commission called the Global Commission for Drug Reform. It's chaired by Kofi Annan, of course, we all know who that is, but it also has some interesting people on it, like Paul Volcker. Now, what the heck does Paul Volcker have to do or care about, really? I mean, the ending of the war on drugs. I would suggest it's got a lot more to do with Street's interest in seeing a descheduling in the U.S. and an open marketplace, because it's a big business. It's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of black market activity that, when it whitens or as it's whitening, will yield a great cloud of, let's say, confusion, which is Wall Street profits from confusion, and investors get mired in misery because of confusion. And the emotional hype that typically comes along with the Wall Street impetus is purposely designed. Maybe I shouldn't say purposely designed. It certainly leverages the confusion. And due diligence is not necessarily at the forefront of many of the investors' agenda when they're running into these things. Just look at technology stocks in the 1990s. For the first 2 or 3 years of technology stocks, the words profit, cash flow, they didn't exist. It was all the potential. And these things were trading at multiples that were completely unsustainable. The entire industry was ridiculously overvalued, which we all can see in a rearview mirror. But what we shouldn't really be focusing in on are the stocks and the securities related to that era that were ridiculously overvalued. It was the trend of the entire cycle of technology and internet stocks that was over-promoted. CNBC launched with fanfare, pounding away every day. The analysts were all, as we know now, in rearview mirror. There was a lot of, to be nice about it, there were some inappropriate emails and conversations occurring around the different investments being promoted. You could say there was some ethical misconduct. Wouldn't be far wrong. The entire industry that era was an example 20 years ago of wealth redistribution to an elite at the top. Now, here we are again, 20 years later, 25 years later, practically 20 years more or less, and there's been a rebuild. People have had the opportunity. They've pumped more paper money in. People think they're wealthier. They have more liquidity sitting on the sidelines than ever, ready to rush into this next new focus of market promotion. And I would suggest that without too much necessary speculation, one can see that there will be a wave of enthusiasm generated here as this market continues to whiten. And unfortunately, what that also means is overpromotion, destruction of value, and most importantly, wealth redistribution to the pockets of those who are very cleverly conducting these operations in these cyclical kind of maneuvers. So people talk about the Elliott wave theory. To me, it's just a redistribution of wealth theory.
Anthony, we have got a break here, but I would love to maybe at another time continue on this discussion on your views of Wall Street or Bay Street, but Wall Street from financial repression, or financial freedom, and your book, and Springboard, because I know you had a lot of strong views in that area, and I think they'd be well received with our viewers. But that's all we can do here today. Got a break. Thank you for your time. Much appreciated, and we're going to talk to you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.